talking a little bit about some of the sort of background principles that are involved in both of our series, because we've had a lot of confusion and arm waving going along in the threads, and I think that this will help clear up sort of the angle that we're coming from.
Exactly. We have a lot of principles that we like to, scientific principles that we like to hold ourselves to when we're doing these episodes. So just to fill you guys in on what those are is kind of why we're making this episode.
Okay, well, I'll start off because it seems to be a daunting task to actually open up Wikipedia and search for various words. I'm going to do it for you. So we're going to start with uniformitarianism, which is a huge word, I know, and a lot of people may not have heard of this unless they've been in science programs. Specifically, geology uses it quite a bit. Basically, it's the assumption that the same natural laws and processes that operate in the universe now have always operated in the universe in the past and apply everywhere in the universe. It also sort of suggests that these principles are going to continue into the future. So there's sort of a gradualistic concept of the past being key to the present and the present being key to the past and the past being key to the future and all that sort of jazz where they're equivalent. And the reason why this is so important is because without this sort of baseline, anything can be anything, right? Like, let's say that gravity didn't exist in the past. Well, that dramatically changes all the assumptions that we can make. We basically can't make any assumptions. So we have to have this baseline.
Yep, and that's exactly why we do it. If we don't assume that something like gravity has always existed and always will exist the way it does, then all of our any kind of assumptions or considerations that we could make about anything would really just be blatant guesswork at best.
Yeah, and you can actually eke out quite a bit from this principle. I mean, if you look at, say, from the anatomy of StarCraft angle, with the evolution of the Zerg and things like that, you have to assume that things like DNA are working in a very similar way with even things like the brand new sort of, or newish concepts like epigenetics, or, allele switching on and off, or, just various sort of paleogenes carrying forward and things like that. It's really important. And you got to also consider that, gravity is affecting these organisms. Things like, I know that they're like the Zerg are often bred for, or are bred for a military purpose, but those same tools, those things like claws and teeth, are things that you'd see in sort of the arms race of evolution today. Things like lions trying to get a step up on the wildebeest, but the wildebeest trying to keep pace as well. It's basically the same thing, only more of an artificial selection. So that's why uniformitarianism is important. And how I can actually say, okay, well, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense within the context of what we can see today.
Yep, and this applies to mechanics as well, but it's more intuitive there. Mainly what we run into with this is the laws of physics. They always have applied and they always will apply, and we have to assume that no matter what, because otherwise we can't say, okay, well, maybe warp gate works through entanglement, or maybe warp gate works through gravitic warps, because if the laws of physics have changed at some point, then all of a sudden we have no idea how anything could work.
Yeah, and really anything can be anything, right? So without something being something, anything can be anything. I know it's kind of a vague statement, but it definitely provides us with a reasonable constraint with which we can look at some of these creatures and technologies and actually move forward in an analytical basis. And this is a very important concept within the scientific community as well. I mean, just look at my profession, paleontology. If we, things like predation didn't exist in the past, then what the hell's the point of the Tyrannosaurus jaw? Right? I mean, so we have to really, really look at things as if there's more consistency. Another thing that we need to bring up is there's this concept called Occam's razor, which is often used in biology under something called parsimony. Or parsimony, however you want to say it. Basically, it's just the concept that the simplest explanation is most likely to be correct. So we often or always assume that it's the most simple one because we have the smallest margin of error there. And this is important, like, for example, when you're trying to make, say, a family tree of, say, dinosaurs, right? You use various distinct characteristics on the bones and things like that to determine relationships, right? And a program spits out sometimes hundreds of different options. And so what you want to do is pick the one with the fewest steps because that's most likely to be correct. Otherwise, you'd end up with a series of 200 ways in which they can relate, and you can't do anything more with it, right? So it's just a good way of sort of narrowing down the options, because I know that there could be like a series of like 5,000 steps involved with warping in a zealot, or there could be just one with that's like 1 or 2 steps. Which one is most likely to be effective and most likely to be utilized? Well, obviously that's a simpler one.
Yep, this is incredibly important in the mechanics episodes because of that fact. Granted, it could be some sort of incredibly complex situation. Looking at a car, you might think, okay, well maybe they don't, need a transmission or something because it would be simpler just to have a straight axle, but we do have a transmission. That's not the case with these technologies of mainly the Protoss. We can't assume that there's these kind of intermediate steps because that's just making things unnecessarily complicated. We can't fully explain with 100% accuracy what we see just in simple steps. So adding more steps to it is really just conjecture, and it doesn't really benefit the discussion of these technologies in any way, unless it's somehow critical to the warping in process. So, like say on a car, you couldn't remove the axle. That would be important. But I mean, you could in theory make a car without a transmission. It would just only have one gear.
You can also remove things like the radio or a whole bunch of other things, right? You could remove the back windshield and it might not impact the overall functionality of the car.
Yep, same
So,
idea.
yeah, exactly. And it seems to me that because the Protoss are very efficiency driven with their technologies, they try to get the most bang for their buck. It just occurs to me that as far as utilizing energy and things like that, it would probably be better to be simpler rather than more complicated.
Yep, that's pretty much the case.
Yeah.
You really don't want to dig too far into it because the only real thing you'll gain is a massive headache.
Yeah, and we one thing we have to do is go on what we can see, right? So, for example, like with the Zergling wings, well, we know that those are wings, and we know that it's a metabolic boost. So we have to look in nature, for example, at what creatures use their wings for a metabolic purpose, even if they do use them for flying as well. Things like dragonflies use them to regulate their temperatures. The same applies for things like say the warp gate technology, right? We have to go on what we see. And while it's true that there are several different conflicting hypotheses, that's sort of the nature of the game with theoretical physics.
Yes, and I know it gets fishy with theoretical physics where it is theoretical and there's a lot of gray area and a lot of really, really strange things that happen. But I mean, again, don't overextend yourselves trying to think about it, because when it comes down to it, what we need is the simplest plausible explanation. It has to work, so don't get me wrong. We're not just going to say, they dematerialize into energy and then they appear there. No, we're not going to just say that. We have to explain this process, but we're not going to add unnecessary steps to that process.
Yeah, we're not going to say like, well, they have to stop at McDonald's first to get some fries, and then they're going to, beam across the galaxy, and then on the other side of the galaxy is where they're going to materialize. And no.
They're not going to all high-five each other on the way, through the warp tunnel or something. There's
through
nothing
the warpter
crazy
slide.
Like that. Yeah, the warpter slide. Aye.
Yeah, it's pretty good. So anyway, that's a little bit of insight into some of the basic principles into the series. Now, that's not to say that we're always going to be 100% correct. We will be revisiting past units and technologies once we get a little bit further into the series. That's why we have this sort of open door policy where anyone can join and give their ideas, because we have had some legitimately awesome concepts and ideas come out of nowhere from people just emailing me or posting them in the threads. It's just that when we shoot things down, it's not necessarily to be jerks or because we've got some ego problem. It's because they're not adhering to like uniformitarianism or Occam's razor or anything like that.
Yep, and the mechanics threads, you guys have been doing a great job. They're remarkably productive. I think every single one of them so far has been on the most popular threads list or whatever, because you guys are constantly throwing out ideas for how this stuff could work. So, make sure to keep it up. Make sure to keep the discussion going. And if you guys don't normally check it out, you just kind of watch the video and leave, you really should, because a lot of stuff gets talked about in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to throw out really quickly that I'd like to I know that Blizzard is watching these videos because they've directly linked to the channel before in their discussion roundup. So if anyone there wants to join us on the show, I'd love to have you, because I think we can get some really cool insight into, the concepts that you're using in your game, and ultimately we can maybe get some more information that we otherwise wouldn't have had.
Yep. Obviously, we would all love to have you on. And if you don't like Zerg, don't worry. You can come on my show instead. Panera's a little creepy because he's Canadian, whatever, but it's all right. We're still good over here.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, leave your comments and questions below. If you're still confused, we'll try to clarify. But hopefully this clears things up.